Hi, before we begin the show, if you've been assigned this podcast by a teacher, could you let us know why? We'd be very interested to know what use our podcasts are being put to in the educational world. Write to us at aithpodcast@gmail.com or contact us through our website, www.aithpodcast.com. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories about the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz, bringing you another episode of our Season 4 as we attempt to track the history of modern Philadelphia theater. Here we go. Theater in North Philadelphia has an eye-catching frontage with a striking mural and large lettering across the front of a 19th century brownstone building that, as we mentioned way back in episode 16, had once been the home of the actor Edwin Forrest. After Forrest's death, as you may remember, the building was expanded to the west, and from 1880 to 1959, it was the home of the Philadelphia School of Design for Women, the predecessor of the Moore College of Art and Design down on Logan Square. But by the mid-20th century, as we detailed in our episode 48 about the Metropolitan Opera House, the surrounding neighborhood of North Philadelphia, especially along Broad Street, but many blocks to the west, north, and east, was now almost entirely and proudly African American. But it was also a neighborhood that suffered from the ills common to such urban neighborhoods and cities all over America. Overcrowding due to housing discrimination elsewhere in the city, poverty due to a lack of opportunity and unemployment, lack of cultural amenities and safe playgrounds for kids due to deliberate political neglect, and crime and violence. The area was fiercely contested between local gangs and the Philadelphia Police Department, run by the infamous Commissioner Frank Rizzo. Still, many grand and beautiful buildings, like Forrest Mansion, some of them, the enormous houses of millionaires from the late 19th century, still stood along North Broad Street. In 1960, the old Forrest Mansion was acquired by the Philadelphia Cotillion Society, a long-standing black social organization which, as its name implies, ran an annual formal society dance. Balls and charity events were held by them for the daughters of wealthy and socially prominent black people in the Philadelphia area. And there were quite a few of these, but they had always been shut out of upper-class white institutions and clubs, and so they had formed their own parallel institutions. The Cotillion Society acquired the former Forrest Mansion / art school, and it had rechristened it as Heritage House. It hoped to make it a place for political organizing and for programs aimed at uplifting the city's less advantaged black youth and offering them cultural programs. One of the community cultural programs was called Theater 14, or Theater XIV, as they wrote it, a consciously interracial amateur theater group that staged classic plays, headed by a Swarthmore graduate named Dolores Gaskins. At one point, she even directed a production there of Death of a Salesman, with the future TV star Sherman Hemsley playing the role of Happy. For 2 years, Theater 14 did shows in the wing adjacent to the main mansion that had once housed Edwin Forrest's collection of art. But by 1968, this group had disbanded. At this point in time, the Cotillion Society offered the theater to John E. Allen. Now, in the early 1960s, John Allen was working at the Sun Oil Company in a management position. And in his spare time, he was studying acting at the Hedgerow Theater School out in the Philadelphia suburbs. Allen had done some work as an actor in local plays. In fact, you may remember from episode 99 that he played one of the three gods in Robert Hedley's production of The Good Person of Shetsuan at Villanova University. But John Allen didn't want to continue on the comfortable middle-class path that his life had taken so far. I hadn't really thought about starting the theater, he told the reporter in an interview. But it was a time of revolution and protests. Blacks were trying desperately to assert themselves in the cause for civil rights. It wasn't long before several of these civil rights activists approached me, wanting to know why I wasn't transmitting what I was learning about the theater to the black community, especially in North Philadelphia. They were right. I was living comfortably, and I understood exactly what the revolution was about. I thought about it, left Hedgerow, withdrew my money from the bank, and rented a storefront. Along with his friend and fellow visionary Robert E. Leslie, in 1966, Allen founded the Freedom Theater in a storefront on the corner of 21st and Ridge Avenue in North Philadelphia. Allen started by giving acting classes to anyone in the community who wanted them, but he and Leslie did not stage plays at first. There was neither the space nor the resources to do so. The organization moved several times, first to the Church of the Advocate on Diamond and 18th Street, and then to the Fairhill Housing Project on 12th and York. And there the theater finally began producing plays like Baldwin's Blues for Mr. Charlie or A Raisin in the Sun, but money remained tight. Despite receiving an offer of a scholarship to attend Yale Drama School, John Allen decided to stick with Freedom Theater. And in 1970, he and Leslie received corporate and foundation grant money to rent a basement at Heritage House to take over where Theater 14 had left off. Now here's where, as we have increasingly done during Season 4 of our podcast, I'm going to turn the storytelling over to someone else. Recorded about 7 years ago, this is a conversation between my dear friend and former colleague at the University of the Arts, the composer, musician, and teacher Charles Gilbert, and Johnnie and Patricia Scott Hobbs. Johnnie Hobbs, as many of you listening know, is a longtime Philadelphia actor who has performed in dozens and dozens of shows with the Freedom Theater, the Drama Guild, the Walnut Street Theater, and many other Philly area theaters over the past 50 years. He was a particularly close associate of the late great director Walter Dallas, and for many years played the griot character in Freedom Theater's famous annual productions of Langston Hughes' Christmas show, The Black Nativity. Patricia Scott Hobbs, who's married to Johnnie, was the choreographer of these shows. Pat is a beloved local choreographer and a longtime dance teacher, both at the Freedom Theater School and at Temple University. Now, back in the pre-pandemic years, Charles Gilbert and I were co-teachers of the theater history course at the UArts theater program. May it rest in peace. In our efforts to give theater history some immediate relevance to our students, we decided to teach a unit on local Philadelphia theater history. And so we were casting around for good material to share with them. And we wanted in particular to document some of the important work done by Philadelphia's African-American nonprofit theater troupe. So Charlie got in touch with Johnnie and Pat and asked them if they wouldn't mind being interviewed for this class project. Charlie and his wife Darcy had known the Hobbses for a long time, going back into the 1980s when he and Johnnie were both teaching at the University of the Arts under the leadership of Walter Dallas. And Walter Dallas, of course, eventually became the head of the Freedom Theater in the 1990s after the passing of Johnnie Allen. We talked about Walter Dallas a lot in my interviews with both Bernard Havard and Mary Robinson. Now, I remembered he had come up in this interview with Johnnie and Pat as I was looking for material about freedom myself for this podcast. So I asked Charlie if he still had a copy of that video, and by gosh, he did, and he sent it to me. So I stripped the sound file from that video, and I edited it down to about 25 minutes of conversation. Here it is.
Talk for a few minutes about Freedom Theater?
Sure.
Yeah, that's a long story for both of you, right?
Yes, it is.
Right. Freedom Theater is a company that at least I've not been able to find really great documentation about the history of that. There's some bits and pieces.
Right.
There's a YouTube interview that Walter did about 10 years ago, talking some about it. That it was 2007, and it was a time when things were very active.
Right. I remember
but
that.
There's obviously a couple of different chapters to the Freedom Theater story, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So who was the first of you to get involved, and when did that happen? I know John Allen started Freedom Theater in 1966, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, John Allen and Bob Leslie sort of founded and co-founded Freedom Theater in '66 out of a movement. John was involved with a movement, a group called the Black People's Unity Movement, and he was charged with responsibility of creating something on the order of theater where people can express and obviously take lessons and things like that. So in '66, he founded the Freedom Theater out of the Black People's Unity Movement, and Bob Leslie came on with him sometime later, and they created the theater. I came to the theater, I believe, in '72. So all of my time up into 2016 is like 44 years. I came to the theater, I was a young man just coming out of the military and had the goals and aspirations of wanting to be the next Sidney Poitier. Therefore, I found out about the Freedom Theater through a friend, and we went down together, and I met there John Allen and started studying classes and studied for a number of years. And that's where I kind of grew up, and John Allen became sort of my surrogate father. And John Allen did something very interesting. He made us believe, or he inspired us to believe that at Freedom Theater, we were institution builders. We were developing something for the community. So I took on the whole mantle of being an institution builder and the Freedom Theater product in a very prideful way. And the philosophy was get to know yourself. And I kind of brought that philosophy to my teaching at the university, in Temple University. So that's when I came to the theater. So let Pat give you her sort of intro into the world.
Okay, so yeah, what's your side of the story?
I came in 1976. At the time, I was at Philadanco. I was a company member, and I was also at Temple University. I was a student. I was a dance major at Temple University, working on a bachelor's in fine arts and performance with a minor in education. And so it was coming around towards the summer, and Joan Myers Brown walked into the room. And she said, "Who needs a summer job?" And I knew in my house I had to have a summer job. Right. So I raised my hand. I had no idea what it was. As far as I'm concerned, we could have been picking daisies. I just needed a job. And it ended up being getting a teaching position at Freedom Theater. So I went to audition for classes there, to teach a class there. They were looking for a dance instructor to instruct their acting students. Right. Because they did a lot of plays with music, plays with movement, and musicals for youth. And so I ended up staying there. And one of the reasons why I ended up staying there is because of the philosophy of teaching was very different from that time. Now that I am older and I have way more experience, one of the things that I understand that was happening there is that they purposefully nurtured the byproduct of arts education, which is an enhancement of life skills and ability to make decisions for yourself, work as a team, having confidence, those types of things. They purposefully kind of promoted that within the arts training, which was very different from my arts training as a dancer. And so I found that to be very attractive.
Right. And where your training maybe focused more on the excellence in the performance itself, and flourishing in a professional sphere, where this philosophy, and did that come from John Allen? Was that really his deal? That he passed on to both of you? That idea that art education changes lives and changes people, regardless of whether or not they go on to be professional artists.
Absolutely. Right. So I mean, I oftentimes think about the thing that I heard you talk about many times, that you are so this the citizen actor, the citizen artist.
Citizen artist, yeah. We still talk about that.
That often think about how the parallel work, because John talked specifically about if you're not going to be a great artist, the acting training, the training that we do here will allow you to go off and become a better parent, will allow you to make some decisions about your life, will allow you to make some decisions about who you are and how you sort of view yourself. And so that kind of inspiration, that kind of confidence, that kind of developmental thing where you develop your persona, develop yourself as a person, was really attractive to me. Number one, I think I needed it. And number two, ultimately in the classroom with teaching, the teaching that I gained from John, I began to see that I can actually sort of articulate what that felt like in a studio, in a classroom. And so, yes, that became a real attractive thing to me, the philosophy of developing yourself as a person as well as this actor that you wanted to be.
Now, I have read that John Allen's roots go back to Hedgerow Theater.
That's right.
Yeah.
Did he ever speak at all about what he took away from his Hedgerow experience, or what those roots meant to him?
He studied with Rose Schumann.
Right.
And he mentioned Jasper Dieter, but he also spoke about Rose Schumann in terms of her very aggressive, right there in the space, create, be responsible for yourself. So I'm sure that some of that also wore off into his sharing with his philosophies at Freedom Theater. But he spoke very highly about his time at Hedgerow. Yes, he did study there for a while.
So that's the 70s. Did you guys meet? Had you met? Were you a couple at this point, or did that happen later on?
No, we met in 76. We met in 76. We were working on a show that we did at Freedom Theater in celebration of the bicentennial called 1 Acre at a Time.
Right.
And in 1 Acre at a Time, Pat ultimately did the choreography. I was in the show. It was a show that they said should run for a year because it dealt with the successes and failures of Black people, and through the whole millennial, and it dealt with this preacher, this reverend, contemplating what he was going to say to his July 4th congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I played Malcolm X in a baseball,
Negro
Leagues, talking about the Negro Leagues,
Yeah.
a whole group of men talking about that. It was a wonderful piece of work called 1 Acre at a Time. And Pat did the choreography, and we met and we got married in 1980 from that time.
I think the other thing that I found fascinating about Freedom Theater, because I wasn't there at the beginning, sometimes my perspective on the history is a little bit different because I had to go into it later. And so one of the things that I found is that John Allen and Bob Leslie were charged with creating a community voice, so to speak, in theater.
Mm-hmm.
And then as they created that voice, they needed people that could express those things. And then one of the things that they found out is that those people didn't have as much opportunity to train in the arts as a larger community did. So it started as adult productions, but then they found they had to start an adult school to teach the skills that they needed to be on stage. And then eventually they got teenagers involved.
Right.
And then eventually, because by the time I got there, I think the teen program had started.
Right.
Okay. And it was relatively new.
Mm-hmm.
But they were doing plays like The Me Nobody Knows and doing it in New York. And then eventually preteens were added, and eventually preschoolers were added. So it was like an outgrowth of necessity.
Yeah.
Then the whole curriculum was developed. My generation was responsible for documenting the curriculum approach and then being able to teach it to other teachers.
Other teachers, yes.
So we had a teacher's training component as well.
Right.
So there's a lot of opportunity. The thing that I liked is there was a lot of opportunity for your own personal growth, but growth of others and growth of philosophies and pedagogies and stuff.
And oftentimes when I think about the Freedom Theater and things we were doing, I think about something like the Negro Ensemble, one of the preeminent Black companies in the country.
Sure.
And I'm thinking that the Freedom Theater was also in parallel with that very same thing. Freedom Theater was in parallel with the growth of the Negro Ensemble as well as the Black arts movement in this country before.
Right.
So, two very strong, important, aspects of artistic growth in this country.
Right. So I would guess now that maybe the next chapter is Walter Dallas arrives in Philadelphia to start the program at UArts and gets, sort of drops in, at least according to the way he tells the story, and becomes involved and kind of quickly moves to the center of the activities, the artistic activities at Freedom Theater, right? So that's the 1980s chapter.
Yes. Walter Dallas knocked on the basement door of the Freedom Theater. I opened the door. I actually opened the door for Walter Dallas. He came in. Walter Dallas, myself, and John Allen sat down and talked, and that was the beginning of Walter Dallas's entrance into the Freedom Theater.
Right.
It's amazing, but that's exactly how it happened. He was living up the street at the hotel up the street. It's Anyways,
Yeah,
it's not far.
I
It's
forget
not
the
far.
name. It's like
And he
two
just
blocks away.
and he just happened to mosey down to the Freedom Theater. He had just finished doing the play in NEC. I forget the name of the play. He had gotten reviews and everything, and he just happened to knock on the basement door. I opened the door for him, and we sat down and talked. So that's exactly how it started.
So during the 80s and really up until the time I met Walter, which was in the late 80s, I guess he was dividing his time
That's right.
between his main gig as director of the School of Theater Arts, but also involved in many ways in making shows and helping build the institution of Freedom Theater, right?
But absolutely, that's exactly how it went.
And then he left UArts to head the Freedom Theater. Was that because John Allen had passed? Is that right?
John Allen, yeah.
He had lung cancer.
Yeah, he was in
And
92.
yes, I believe it was around 92. And
Yeah.
so he knew that he needed somebody to take on the reins of Freedom Theater. I think John was very much involved in that conversation with Walter.
Yes.
Well, I certainly I remember the moment of him leaving UArts, which then began a new chapter for us there.
That's
but
right.
It seemed to me that at that point, starting in the 90s, that Freedom Theater really began to take off in a much more ambitious way. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. Well, he created a kind of some equity shows. He brought in some equity actors, and we were all
national profile.
National profile had been lifted as a result of Walter's, philosophies and bringing in things. It was extremely exciting. The show that we were doing annually, Black Nativity, was doing quite well. With Pat won several awards for choreography. Anyway, it was just a very high time, very energized time. And we moved into a new theater, the Johnnie Allen Theater, in the space there that was also under construction before John passed away. So a lot of good things were happening, and we felt good about the progress that we were making.
What were some of the memorable projects from that time period? I know Walter talks about Cooley High as being one of those that was, and I guess doing the adaptation of Sparkle, but maybe there are things that you remember as well.
For me, I have to say that Black Nativity was a highlight for me in a lot of different ways.
It was like a Philadelphia tradition for a number of years.
That's right.
There were several different things that were very exciting about that show. Number one, I was at Philadanco when there was a choreographer there. His name was Harold Pearson. And he did, I think in the bicentennial, he did a dance work which told the history of African-American dance from 1620 to the present day. Like it was like a 2-hour kind of piece.
Wow, ambitious.
Very ambitious. And it also required us to learn several forms of dance and historical dance. I had always been interested in historical dance, but I think that solidified it for me, even though I was young and didn't understand that that's what was going on. So when I did Black Nativity, it allowed me to use a lot of that historical information in that show. It also allowed us to, we always did youth productions at the show. And because a lot of my work over the 40 years was done with the youth of the theater, but it allowed them to cross over and do what they call bridge to the repertory theater, to be involved in programs like that, so that they got an opportunity to see what it was like to be in an equity show and what were the professional standards. And so we had children's chorus and we had interns that came in from the school. And then I got an opportunity to work with many different directors on one project. So Black Nativity was done with Ozzie Jones first. I did that with him. It was a smaller production. Then I worked with...
now you got to say name.
Oh my goodness. Clifton Turner Davis. And then I got to work with Walter Dallas. And all of them were, the essence of it was the same, but it was slightly different. And so it allowed several different expressions of the same piece of work. So it was very exciting for me. The other thing that I found very satisfying is to work with youth students in youth productions. A lot of youth productions at the theater, well, I would say all of them, except for maybe the Me Nobody Knows, all of them were original. So they were written by Gail Leslie, a woman named Tracy Kershaw, Diane Leslie, John Alan and Bob Leslie, they wrote a few, and all of them dealt with youth issues. Some of the ones were like Under Pressure, which dealt with youth, drugs, sex, violence.
We had Under Pressure. We had May We Go Round. We had Hopscotch Frogs, Dogs, and James Brown.
Yes. And we had Journey of a Gun, which talks about gun violence in the schools. Safety Street, which talked about just general safety, a fun way of looking at safety in your community. And 12 Going on 20, which was a fantasy about a young girl kind of finding learning some values about life by playing a fantasy game. So there are a lot of different ways that we were able to get youth involved. Plus, we were able to do dance concerts with the kids. We did a whole lot.
Walter just encouraged and lifted the artistic aesthetic of Freedom Theater. And, people started, really noticing the kind of work that we were doing. When he first came to the theater, he cast me in a play called The Black Picture Show, which was extremely challenging piece of work by Bill Gunn about an artist. We did it 2 different times, and he just really challenged me throughout my career with Freedom Theater, with shows either in the Freedom Theater or, we did some shows at the Art and
Simply
Heavenly and Blue Door. And so he just lifted the artistic aesthetic of the Freedom Theater and really challenged me personally as an artist as well.
Now, am I remembering right that Simply Heavenly was at the Schubert Theater at one point, at the Marion Theater?
We invited, Melba Moore was in that.
Right.
She was my love interest opposite. Working with the great Melba Moore.
Yeah, so that was a kind of a high profile project with a star like Melba Moore and a star like Johnnie Hobbs Jr. But on a big stage like that was an ambitious project.
Absolutely, yeah. Very successful. Yes.
So I guess the next point in the journey comes when Walter steps down, or kind of the end of Walter's time, because things go up and then they start to come down. Is that right? What goes up must come down.
But how would you describe that? You were there in the hall.
Yeah, I would say that Freedom Theater began to experience some financial difficulties. Some of that would have to be discussed with the Freedom Theater itself. That is not something that I can really expound on at this time. Just like anything else, we were part of a working capital kind of situation at the theater where they were working with theaters that had been in business for like over 25 years. So there were some challenges that theaters experience.
And as you have your own theater. Physical building to maintain and pay the mortgage on and finish the construction of and all of that. Yeah. See, Freedom Theater was certainly not alone in the early in the late 90s and early 2000s, competing for fundraising with other worthy projects and other bigger projects. And so Freedom Theater was not the only company to struggle. I'm also aware of how that affected the Prince Music Theater in that same time period. Oh, yeah. But anyway, so there were challenges as the company matured.
Right.
And then eventually that led to Walter's stepping down.
Yeah. It led to his stepping down. And at this point, I mean, I don't really know what the Freedom Theater is engaged in now.
But Pat, you continued to work there, right, and be the central part of their education program for years after Walter left, right? Because it wasn't, you were there until I guess 2016 when the kind of when the doors were abruptly shut on you. But you remained there for a lot of years, right?
Yes.
And the education program was still, the school was kind of the heart of the theater then.
Yes.
And since 2016, there's been a new team there and certainly some turmoil that's been documented in the press and in other places as well.
Yeah. I guess that's all I can say is yeah.
Yeah. I guess I'm fascinated, that there are a couple of Philadelphia theaters that really started out with super worthy missions and really amazing people. And again, I'm thinking both Freedom Theater and the American Music Theater Festival / Prince Music Theater.
Right.
I put them both in this category. They grew, they built their own theaters. They had a kind of a moment when it was just awesome.
Yes.
But then it didn't last. It was not sustainable. And so just like, for many things, there is a season, and there's a season to grow, and there's a season, to reap the harvest. And then there's a season of winter that comes after that.
Yes.
Well, it's certainly it's been a huge piece of both of your lives. I mean, not only the institution that brought you together, but also you poured your hearts and your lives into that for so many years. So it's really amazing to hear you to talk about it and remember those chapters of it.
Exciting times, Charlie. Exciting times, and times that I think of John Allen every day. It's not a time. It's not a time of the day that his memory does not go through my head, and just in terms of thinking about what he did, who he was. Also, Bob Leslie as well.
Right.
But
they opened the doors for a lot of people to participate in arts, which I think is just wonderful.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And we see it in the lives of our students today. They're running dance companies. They're rehearsal masters for dance company. I have one in London. Mm-hmm. They went to the Alvin Ailey Company. Mm-hmm. They're entrepreneurial. They have a one-man play that they tour in various places. So it's very exciting.
Are there particular alumni? I mean, I know Leslie Odom Jr. is often pointed to as a particular alumni that people whose names they remember. But are there other, like individual names you recall that, of people who've gone on and done interesting things?
We have Eric Alexander.
We have Eric Alexander, who went with The Cosby Show and then eventually Living Single.
Wanye.
Wanye, who was with Boyz II Men. We have Abdul Rahim Jackson, who went to Alvin Ailey.
We have the young man that came to see Thurgood.
Gary Dourdan, who did CSI. It's always when people ask that question, it's kind of like I'm stuck.
Yeah.
But then I see them. But the other thing is that I think is important is to understand that one of the things that John Allen always said is everybody that's sitting in this room is not going to be an artist.
Right.
And so you want to take the skills that you have to become a better and more productive person in life.
Yep.
So we have people that are doctors, people that are lawyers. I have a young lady who is running the fitness program at the Croc. There are a lot of people that have come through Freedom Theater as performers that are still working. Joelette Harris did a lot of work at the Freedom Theater.
Right.
Brian Wilson did a lot of work at the Freedom Theater. Ozzie Jones, who directs a lot around the city, he came through the Freedom Theater. There are people that are running schools and things. So it's a lot of things. It's really interesting when you have to name a person.
I recall to a friend recently, I said I was in the Freedom Theater, and I was in the basement. And I walked in the back, and sitting in the back was this little man. And he evidently was interviewing people. There was no one there at the moment. So I walked in. I said, hello, this is a number of years ago. I said, who are you? What's your name? I said, my name is Johnnie Hobbs. He says, my name is Lynn Stallmaster. And he's one of the greatest casting directors in the world, sitting in the basement of the Freedom Theater. I think John had worked something out with Mike Lemon or something where he was occupying the space. But it's amazing, and I walked in one day and there was Cleavon Little sit in the basement there. And I met Cleavon Little in the basement.
Yeah.
We've had a number of guests over. John used to get these people from Gregory Hines. I mean, he came to the Freedom Theater on a number of occasions and really loved the energy at the theater. But John and I used to somehow get these people to come down to the Freedom Theater and talk to the students and that kind of thing. So it was just so exciting and memorable and indelible for me.
Well, this is what great stories you've had. I'm going to wrap it up there just because I've really imposed on you for a long time, and we've told some great stories. So thank you both for sharing your memories. I'm going to just stop the recording now.
Okay.
So that was Charlie Gilbert's interview with the Hobbses. And although it's a little sad now to listen to it, because just in passing they mention both the director Walter Dallas and the actress Joylette Harris as if they are still alive, when in fact both of those wonderful people passed away not too long after this interview was made. I'd like to thank Charlie Gilbert and Johnnie and Pat, who all gave their consent for me to use this archival material for the podcast. In the future, we'll be sharing some other archival interviews, that is, voices of important people in Philadelphia theater history, but in recordings of interviews that I may not have originally conducted myself. And I'm so glad at last to talk about the Freedom Theater, which really I've been disgracefully leaving out of the overall narrative of the podcast up to now. But we will certainly return to it as we continue to talk about Philly theater in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s. And although it is, for the moment, mostly inactive as a producing and educational organization, we'll leave its recent history for another day, perhaps. As I've said many times, I get nervous when the conversation starts discussing events within the past decade or so. I'll happily cede that territory to others. But let me say that I'm also glad to bring you a conversation with somebody who is not a director or an artistic director of a theater. As much as directors are a fantastic resource and artistic directors are people with deep institutional knowledge, we have to remember that a huge majority of working theater artists do not stay at just one theater company during their careers. They tend to move around. And I'll try and get these voices of more Philly actors, choreographers, stage managers, designers, and other folks in the future, I promise. If you've been enjoying this season of the podcast or have any thoughts or suggestions or compliments, drop us an email at aithpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. To support the show, go to www.patreon.com/AITHpodcast. There will also be additional images and information, as always, in the episode blog on our website. Look for it in the show notes. Or, a free and easy way to support us is to leave a review about the show on our website. And you can review us on Facebook and follow us there, or on Instagram, or even Blue Sky, all places where we post information about Philadelphia theater every single day. This is your self-appointed Philly theater history maven, Peter Schmitz, signing off. Our original theme music and transition music was composed by Christopher Mark Colucci. The sound editing and engineering for this episode was all done by my humble self right here in the control room of our glittering sound studio of our podcast world headquarters, high atop the Tower of Theater History. Thanks to all of you for listening to the show today and for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia. Hi, folks. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast episode, you might certainly want to check out the book I wrote. It is also entitled Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia, and is published by Brookline Books, a division of Casemate Group. This book is a feast of short chapters covering every major era and major figure of theater history in the Quaker City, with lots of surprise appearances by many historical figures that you might not expect to find there. Everyone from Oscar Wilde to Muhammad Ali. Order it at your local independent bookstore, and of course it's also available at large brand name bookstore chains and at all major online booksellers. Just search for Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. Of course, you can also literally check out this book at many local libraries. If it's not in their collection already, ask your local library to obtain a copy, and then you can read it at no charge. Or you can do what I did, buy a copy of the book and donate it to your own favorite local library so you can share the gift of fun and fascinating theater history with others. We love libraries and librarians and all they do to keep things civilized in this crazy world. In fact, on Sunday, June 29th, I will be appearing at the Brookline Books stall at the 2025 American Library Association Annual Conference and Exhibition at the Philadelphia Convention Center. If you're a librarian, or a fan of libraries and are coming to the ALA, please be sure to stop by and say hello.